The unstoppable force is about to meet the immovable object, and they both look, they look a little different than I thought they would. Greetings, my friend. I am Sir Josborn, and welcome to a Thought of the Night on Zacian and Zamazenta's designs. Before we get started, just know that Thought of the Night is a series with little to no visual editing, so feel free to open up another tab or work on something else while you listen along. You won't hurt my feelings one bit. Now then, I find it very interesting that throughout the entire very interesting promotional cycle for Sword and Shield, and all of the conversations that it sparked in the community, that people tend to agree on one thing. Despite how they may feel about the Dexit controversy, or some of the features added into the game, or certain other Pokemon that are being added, most people tend to agree that Zacian and Zamazenta don't leave very much of an impression. Which isn't to say that these two are poorly designed by any means. There's a reason that this isn't an episode of Characterized. On Characterized, we go more in-depth on what a character or set of character designs are trying to communicate specifically, but we don't know what these two are trying to communicate. We don't know anything about them really beyond their names and their appearance. So we can't really dig in and say whether or not these two are poorly designed yet, because we don't know what they're trying to communicate. However, what we can talk about is whether or not our brand new box legendaries make a good impression using nothing but their character designs. Because really, that's all we have so far, that and their names. Here, I'll even read you off everything that we know about them from the official Pokemon website. First off, we have Zacian. Its shining blade can cut through anything. Zacian attacks so gracefully that its movements can even captivate its opponents. It holds what appears to be a sword in its mouth. And then we have Zamazenta. Its gleaming shield can turn back any attack. Zamazenta's regal and majestic movements overwhelm any opponents that dare face it. Its body is covered in what seems to be a shield. And that, my friends, is all we know about our two box legendaries for the Pokemon games that are releasing in nearly a month. Which isn't a bad thing, don't get me wrong. I really like the slow drip feed of information that we've gotten about Sword and Shield and the Pokemon involved with it. I'm hoping that it'll lead to a very fresh experience for the games once they release, as long as things don't get leaked beforehand, or as long as, Game Freak or the Pokemon Company doesn't decide to just reveal everything about the games the week before launch. But as it stands, I'm actually pretty happy with this limited information. And this lack of information actually leaves Zacian and Zamazenta in kind of an exciting place for someone like me who likes to talk about character designs a lot, because we get to use just their designs, unclouded with any other information, to examine whether or not they are impressive by box legendary standards, and really get to the core of what makes a good box legendary design. Which then begs the question, what exactly does make a good box legendary design? And I think I've narrowed it down to about 4 points that we can really focus in on to see what makes these designs the most effective. And those 4 points are that the legendaries need to communicate their in-game mechanics well. That means their stats, their types, and their move pool, mainly. They need to communicate the story or the tone of the games that they represent in some way. They need to feel very powerful, very impressive, like a force of nature. And they need to feel like a powerful and impressive force of marketing. First off, let's examine their possible mechanics and what they might represent there, because I think that these two give us good stat information, certainly. Zacian is most likely very speedy, with high attack stats. Meanwhile, Zamazenta is a little bit slower, but a lot bulkier, with larger hit points and defense. So there's not really a whole lot of speculation to go on there. I think that the stats are communicated fairly clearly, but we'll see if they do something weirdly subversive with that or not in the final game. But as it stands, that's probably what their stats are like. Typing is a little bit more interesting, because I'm really not sure what type these two will be. The idea of swords and shields obviously brings to mind the thoughts of steel typing, but when you look at these two, steel typing doesn't really come to mind just from their designs. Maybe a little bit more so with Zacian, since it has a literal sword in its mouth, but even then, it doesn't look very metallic by any means. Nothing on them really does. During their reveal trailer, they glow a little bit, but it doesn't really have a sheen to it. Neither their sword nor their shield. There's nothing really metallic about it, nothing steel-like about them. So while the idea of swords and shields may bring to mind steel typing, I'm not really sure if the specific design choices really support that. The next most quote-unquote obvious type choice then would probably be fighting type, since swords and shields are both very combat-oriented items. The idea of them being fighting types is certainly not out of the realm of possibility by any means. But aside from steel and fighting, I'm really not sure what these two could bring to the table. There might be sort of a thing where Zacian is maybe a water type, and then Zamazenta is a fire type, since Zacian is a little bit more flowing and carries a little bit more blue with it. Meanwhile, Zamazenta feels a little bit more fiery and has its red accentuated a little bit more in its design. But there's really nothing to say either way, and that's not a bad thing, exactly. But it's very interesting that after all these years, we can be presented with a design for a Pokemon and not really be entirely sure of the type that it is without it being a new type, which is a possibility, but I don't think it's a very likely one. So their typing situation is certainly an interesting one. I'll give it that. Then as far as move pools go, that's sort of communicated about as well as the stats, I would say. Zacian is probably a lot more attack-oriented. Can probably use moves like Sacred Sword or whatnot. Probably some attack buffing moves. Meanwhile, Zamazenta is probably a little more sturdy, maybe a little more wear them down over time kind of a Pokemon, you know? But there isn't really anything hyper-specific. Obviously, Zacian is going to get a lot of slashing attacks. Zamazenta is going to get a lot of guarding attacks. But there's not a whole lot there. Again, that's partially because we don't really know their typings either. So it leaves their move pools in kind of an interesting place as well. So overall, mechanically, I would say that these two are in a very intriguing place at the moment. Maybe not very intriguing, maybe just a little intriguing, but certainly intriguing on some degree. While they may wear their stats on their sleeves, absolutely, the way that their typing is left kind of ambiguous, and thus their move pools are left a little ambiguous, makes me a little bit more excited to meet them and to catch them and to see what they can really do in a battle. Because maybe they can pull out something really crazy that nobody would expect, and their designs are meant to make those crazy things feel a little bit more exciting when they happen, rather than feeling so obvious. But with their mechanics pretty well covered, let's move on to their potential story and tone implications, because that's where things start to get more interesting. Legendaries do usually represent the story or the tone of the games that they represent in some way, at least. Kyogre and Groudon, for example, gave off an idea of the earth versus the sea very clearly. Xerneas and Yveltal were pretty clearly life and death. Meanwhile, ones that represented more of a general tone of the games were Solgaleo and Lunala, with an adventurous or mysterious air to them, and Palkia and Dialga gave you this impression of a larger-than-life, abstract concept. So it leads you to think, what kinds of concepts or feelings or themes are they trying to evoke with Sword and Shield using Zacian and Zamazenta? These two truly are the most similar box legendaries to date, which, for box legendaries, is very weird. There's usually a duality to them, and that's usually a bit of a marketing ploy to kind of get you to feel like you might need to buy both if you want to get the full story, even though you definitely don't. But there's usually a duality to it. And while, yes, there is certainly a very strict distinction between swords and shields just as objects, these two Pokemon share so many design elements that it doesn't feel like there's any sort of duality going on. It doesn't feel like there's much of a conflict. Even in their reveal trailer, they don't really get into any kind of conflict. Sometimes with these reveal trailers, the Pokemon are duking it out, or they're in some sort of a battle, but not here. Which begs the question of why exactly do these two look so similar? What are they trying to convey with these similarities? Because when you think to past legendaries, we've never really had this. Reshiram and Zekrom shared very similar body types to each other, but that was to convey their connection. They have a very strict connection. Solgaleo and Lunala shared a few design elements, but that was because they evolved from the same Pokemon, and even then, those two look wildly different from each other. So why, even when we have legendaries with a very strict connection to each other in the past, why did they feel the need to make these two look this similar? It's a question that I hope has a really intriguing answer. I'm not sure if it will, but it's got me a little hopeful for them. I know that it's put a lot of people off, and I was put off with it initially as well, because it doesn't make them stand out from each other very much, but the more I think about it lore-wise, the more I think that this could lead to some very interesting stuff. Because these two do have some very interesting uniting factors that could lead somewhere kind of neat. They're both very fluffy, they both very apparently have majestic or graceful movements to them, which gives them a very regal description. They both have these crown-like crests on their head. They both have a primary color scheme, which is interesting. That is easily their biggest uniting common factor. Primary color schemes are usually used to highlight a character of importance. They're usually leaders in some type of a regard. Not all the time, there are no strict rules in character design, but most of the time that's what you'll tend to see. Primary color schemes mean that a character is very important. And while box legendaries are certainly important, we've never seen two legendaries really share the same color scheme before. Granted, Zacian is a lot more subdued. You could almost say that Zacian's colors are more pastel, meanwhile Zamazenta's are much more saturated and vibrant. But that doesn't take away from the fact that these are still, at their core, the same ideas for color schemes. And it's not a color scheme that we've ever really seen legendaries have before. And it's certainly never been highlighted in such a prominent way, because when you look at these two side by side, that's the first thing you notice. And then the second thing that you're probably going to notice is that these are both wolf-like creatures wielding very human weapons, a sword and a shield. These are objects that are very, very strictly associated with knighthood, especially when you put them both together. So the fact that they keep them on all fours rather than making them bipedal is an interesting choice. And it got my gears turning a little bit in some interesting ways, because when you put an animal character design and you keep it on all fours, that usually makes it feel more natural. When you choose not to anthropomorphize an animal-like character design, that makes it feel more like it's naturally a part of the world around it. It makes it feel like it has a place in that world. But swords and shields don't necessarily have a place in the natural world. They're very man-made objects. Are these objects actually more natural to them than the descriptions may suggest? Were they born with these objects? Did they find them? Did somebody make these for them? It makes my gears turn, and I kind of like that. I don't know if they're going to go anywhere interesting with it or not, but at least at the moment, at these preliminary, just thoughtful stages before the game comes out, I am intrigued to see where that goes, because this is a very specific design choice. To have just these normal wolves, basically, just wielding a sword and a shield. It's interesting to me, and I hope that they do something cool with it. And then that brings us to the idea of swords versus shields as thematic elements as well. Because with Black and White, they did this sort of thing with ideals versus truth, which wasn't executed insanely well, but it was an attempt, certainly. Meanwhile, with swords and shields, what could they be trying to convey with this? Because keep in mind that this is a drastic change in naming convention for the Pokemon games as well. Up until now, we've just had general colors, gemstones, letters, planets. It's been concepts that are very vague, or things like the sun and the moon, which are very out of reach and which feel like they're usually associated with higher beings or out of reach concepts. Meanwhile, swords and shields, again, those are very human things. So what could that mean for the potential story or the vibes that the game is going to try to give off? Is the story going to go for a more precautionary versus an actionary approach? or protective versus proactive. But then you think about how Zacian and Zamazenta have been presented thus far. We don't have very much about how their personalities seem to mesh or how they're distinct from one another, but from what little we do have, it seems like Zacian is a little more calm, a little more patient. Meanwhile, Zamazenta feels a little more bold and daring. On their box art, Zacian is waiting patiently, meanwhile, Zamazenta is roaring. It seems like the sword is being patient, and the shield is being more proactive, which is an interesting subversion to how we would normally think of swords and shields. So how much is it going to try to subvert those ideas, if at all? Because again, we still don't know very much about these two. We don't know anything about their temperaments, really. That's just a guess from the box art, but is it going to try to subvert that? Is it going to make Zamazenta the more driven Pokemon? Meanwhile, Zacian is the more complacent Pokemon. Or is it simply going to go for more of a sturdy versus swift sort of thing? Is it going to go more basic with just ideas of bulkiness versus stabbiness? All of this leads me to feel that story-wise, Sword and Shield could be a little bit different than past Pokemon games. With the fact that our legendaries look this similar, with the fact that we have such a new and interesting naming convention with swords and shields, I'm hoping that these two do something new and interesting. I don't necessarily expect it to, by any means. I don't expect anything out of my Pokemon stories, but I'm hoping that they try something a little bit new, at least. Because that's part of why I liked Black and White's narrative. Was it executed very well? Not really, no. But it was interesting, it was fresh, it was new, it was exciting, and I appreciated that. And that's why it's one of the most fondly remembered Pokemon stories. So here's hoping that with even just the designs of these Pokemon to guide that sort of thought process, that these games do something interesting with their stories and their theming. But now that we've covered those first two subjects, the last two, how these guys should look powerful and how they should be really big forces of marketing, go hand in hand with each other, and how those are the aspects where they are lacking more than anywhere else, really. Because it is important for the box legendaries to be marketable and to be impressive. They are the boxes of the game. There's not a lot of frills on Pokemon box art, which is a whole nother video for a whole nother day, but these two are what you see when you go in to buy the game. When you're just browsing around the store, these are what you see. When you look up anything about these games online, the legendaries are going to show up just as much, if not more so, than the starter Pokemon. But these two don't leave that much of an impression, and that's a bit of an issue. And it's kind of interesting as far as legendaries go, because while their similarities may lead to something very interesting lore-wise, it may not, but it very well may, it makes them feel less appealing at a glance, which is really important. I want you to think about this. These two Pokemon were revealed months ago. Now I want you to think about how much fan art and how much fan discussion you've seen about these two Pokemon. Now I want you to compare that level of fan art, that level of community engagement with these two Pokemon, with the level of engagement for Sirfetch'd, or for Galarian Ponyta, who was revealed just a few days ago, and who I've already seen infinitely more fan art of than either Zacian or Zamazenta. It's weird. These two just don't make a great impression on a glance. Once you start thinking about them and you start thinking about the potential implications, things get more interesting. But at a glance, they don't really do it, and that's an issue. And because they represent these games which are supposed to make an impact, these legendaries are supposed to make an impact on your mind. But they just don't. And this is due to a couple of reasons. Part of it is because of their similarities, yes. It doesn't really make your eye want to look at them a whole lot, because when you have the duality between the legendaries, you'd like to examine both of them, you like to think about which one of them you really prefer over the other, you'd like to think about just them being and the interactions between the two of them. But when you have legendaries that look this similar, you don't really think about that. They sort of blend together in your mind. At least they do at first glance. There are definitely some distinctions between them, absolutely, but the fact that they share so many design elements makes them a little less intriguing. It makes it less exciting to think about which one you would rather encounter and go on a journey with. It just makes you feel more like you'll get the version that you happen to like a little bit more, whether you like swords more or shields more, and then you'll encounter this Pokemon at some point, and then when you do, you're pretty sure that they'll just, exchange it for the exact same one over in the other version. And that's not exciting. It's not exciting to think about. Like, take Kyogre and Groudon, for instance. Not that these two are amazing hallmarks of legendary design, but they have certain qualities to them that I think these guys could learn a little bit from. Because when you think about these games, I want you to take yourself back in time. I want you to think that Generation 3 is right around the corner, and you gotta pick a game. All you know is that Groudon's the land, Kyogre's the water. You gotta pick one. You're gonna spend at least some time thinking about which one you would prefer, or spend some time thinking about justifying which one you prefer to your friends who choose the other one. It's exciting. It's fun to talk about these sorts of dualities with the legendaries. And now think about Zacian and Zamazenta, and that's just not as fun. There's nothing to really dissect between the two of them at a glance. Nothing on a base level that really stands out and makes you think, oh yeah, that's the one I definitely prefer. The only thing that you're really going to be thinking about when choosing a game is whether you like swords more or shields more. That and the other exclusive Pokemon in the games, but when it comes to just these legendaries, their designs don't carry enough individuality to make you think about them for an extended period of time. And again, that doesn't exactly make them bad. It just makes them less effective at this specific job of a box legendary. Speaking of the boxes, this box art is weak. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen by any means, but it's not very good either. And again, I could go into more details about that some other day, but for right now, these backgrounds are basically non-existent. I don't like these logos. And these two Pokemon on the front don't inspire me at all. These poses are very weak. Zacian looks a little too patient for my liking. Doesn't really look like he's doing anything. And Zamazenta, while it looks like he's roaring at something, it doesn't really carry a lot of interest with it. And I think part of this is due to the cropping of the new Switch boxes for these two. It feels like these two may have been designed a little more preliminarily for 3DS box art, because Solgaleo fit really well onto 3DS box art. Meanwhile, these two, you kind of have to cut off half of them, and so you don't really get a feeling of where they're standing or whether or not they're very planted. You just get these wolves that are just kind of here. It's not interesting. When you look at it, you don't want to look at it for very long. And to be fair, that's been a problem for other legendaries in the past, too. Groudon and Kyogre, for some of the things that they do well, their box art is insanely boring. It's absolutely boring. Meanwhile, we've just had some of the best Pokemon box art, in my opinion, with Sun and Moon, and those two made it feel a lot more interesting to look at them and to look at the box art. These two don't really do that. And again, that's weird for the box legendaries, because that's one of their main jobs, is to make the boxes appealing. And again, we've come a long way from Groudon and Kyogre to Solgaleo and Lunala. There have been a lot of improvements up to that point, but now it feels like it's regressed a step, and the box art just does not look very nice. And their designs just don't help it at all. They don't feel like they carry a whole lot of presence to them. These two just don't carry a lot of visual weight with them right now. Their bodies are just a little bit basic. It feels like the sword and the shield don't add a lot to the design. They don't necessarily take away from it, but they don't make the designs more interesting either. And that's kind of the core of why these designs feel a little underwhelming. They may be similar, yes, but that's not exactly what makes them less impressive than previous legendaries. It's that combined with their lackluster stances. It's that combined with their unimpressive emotions. We don't really know what these guys feel like, you know? All of these things are why Zacian and Zamazenta feel less impressive overall. It's why there hasn't been very much discussion about them. It's why people aren't talking about them nearly as much as any of the other Pokemon that have been revealed, even though it's been months and months, and these are the box legendaries that are supposed to really represent the game more than anyone else. These guys just fall short when it comes to being impressive. It feels like they need more distinguishing factors, something a little more exciting, something unique, because as it stands, these two just look more like wolves that happen to be carrying a sword and that happen to be wearing a shield. And at this point in Pokemon's lifetime, we just kind of expect a little bit more than that, something a little bit more intriguing. And again, these designs aren't necessarily quote-unquote bad because of this lack of distinction, because of this lack of impressiveness. They're just a little weaker at their jobs. Now, what kind of context could make these designs feel a little bit more impressive? Well, I would be surprised if these were their final forms, exactly. At the end of their reveal trailer, they were both glowing. Zacian's sword changed a little bit. I would be very surprised if these two didn't have some sort of a secondary form, if they didn't have like a true form, and that could very well make these two a lot more impressive at the end of the day. They can make them feel a lot more interesting and a lot more individualistic as far as the Pokemon lineup goes. It's also very likely that there's another legendary or set of legendaries that could give a little bit more context to this, especially color-wise, maybe something that just really contrasts with the primary color scheme of these two. It's certainly possible that there's other Pokemon that would just make these two feel better when you put them all together. But as it stands, these two really are possibly the least immediately likable legendaries so far. But there's still a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot of opportunities to make these designs really great with context. And I'm honestly excited to see it. I have some mixed feelings about Sword and Shield now, but as it stands, these two really are possibly the least immediately likable legendaries to date. But there is still a lot of things that we don't know. A lot of opportunities to make these designs better with context, and I honestly want to hear what you guys have to say about them. What do you think about Zacian and Zamazenta's designs? Please let me know in the comments down below, and remember to subscribe, hit the bell, all that good stuff. So until next time, remember to stay amazing, and play with honor.